Hello, and welcome to Hospice Insights, the Law and Beyond, where we connect you to what matters in the ever-changing world of hospice and palliative care. Pulling the strings. New OIG audits scrutinize how hospices used provider relief funds. For the last 2.5 years, hospices and other providers have been using billions in provider relief payments to prepare for, respond to, and recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. The OIG has begun its nationwide audit of providers' use of these payments, removing any remaining doubt as to whether these payments came with very significant strings attached. In this episode, I talk with Bryan Nowicki and Andrew Brenton, who share their experiences regarding the purpose and nature of these audits and offer practical takeaways for hospices. Andrew, our PRF guy, it's not sticking for me, but you have been working with me and Bryan since the very beginning on all these provider relief fund issues. So thinking back, putting together that original slide deck when all this stuff was coming out and trying to create a framework of how to track lost revenues and expenses and all this stuff. And it was all in preparation for what is now happening, right?
Yep.
Which is the accountability through these OIG audits. So we've been working on these. And so what have we found out about these OIG audits on provider relief funds?
Hey, Meg, nice to be here. And yeah, you're exactly right. It's hard to believe it's been almost 2.5 years since the provider relief fund payments were authorized by the CARES Act, but here we are. And so what's kind of been happening lately are these OIG audits. So this was expected. I mean, the OIG and HRSA have been giving hints that these audits were coming. And in fact, the CARES Act actually included a requirement for HHS to do such an audit. But basically last month in July, some hospices began receiving letters from the OIG kind of putting them on notice that the OIG was had selected them for an audit on the use of their provider relief fund payments, specifically though those payments received in calendar year 2020. So provider relief fund payments have been distributed since April 10th, 2020, and even as recently as earlier this month, we know some hospices have received additional provider relief fund payments, but this audit is focused specifically on use of payments received in 2020. We also know that 30 hospices across the country were selected for this audit. And in talking to the OIG and kind of helping some clients with this OIG audit process, we've learned that this 30 hospice OIG audit is part of a much larger nationwide audit of other provider types. And that the hospices that were selected were specifically selected based on geography, based on the amount of payment received. But hospices that are affiliated with a healthcare system were not selected for this audit because the OIG in kind of the other OIG teams that are doing these audits, they would have selected hospices, as part of a bigger system. So here the hospices are the ones that are selected for the audit are unaffiliated with a healthcare system.
Well, and to pause there for a second, I mean, these audits, and I think that a lot of our listeners will be like, you've been doing a lot about OIG audits, like they're just fast and furious. And, I think we had the OIG audits that were provider specific audits, the ones that were made public that focused on hospice eligibility. Obviously, those require lots and lots of work to respond to. And then you have other OIG audits that are work plan projects that, when they were doing things about RN supervisory visits. I mean, that didn't take a lot of time to respond to. And just to get, so people get a sense, this is a pretty rigorous audit. I mean, you have a lot of questions to answer. And I know you and Bryan work real closely with the client, but it's a lot. I mean, to do a good job responding takes some time and energy and resources you got to devote to this.
Yep, that's absolutely right. We spent a good chunk of July preparing, responses for this client related to this OIG audit. There were three separate kind of requests, ranging from just kind of requests for narrative descriptions to various questions. There was also a pretty ample document request list with about 20 or so types of documents that were requested, mostly kind of trying to get at documentation substantiating increased healthcare expenses attributable to the coronavirus or lost revenue attributable to the coronavirus. And in talking to the OIG, what it sounds like is going to happen is that towards probably the middle of next year, all the different divisions in the OIG that are doing these provider audits, they're going to put together kind of a single draft report that will not be at the provider level. It'll be kind of an aggregate report that'll then be sent to HRSA, which is an agency within HHS, for their public comment. And we did hear that as part of that submission, the OIG will be including provider level data, but it sounded like that wouldn't be public, and that the draft public report would be, kind of aggregated so that it wouldn't kind of reflect kind of provider specific findings.
Which is a really important point because the OIG hospice specific audits on eligibility, I mean, those, as everyone knows, are public. Your name is attached to it. And so in terms of, preparation and all of that, that was something that I know we wanted to get out on the table right away to understand that, to prepare our clients. But Bryan, you're so quiet. Quiet Bryan.
I wanted to let Mr. PRF have his moment in the sun here. So
I know.
Andrew has been an essential part of our team for all this. He is the master of PRF, and his skills have been really critical to helping the client, but have also allowed us to cut through a lot of noise out there regarding these and really help clients make very concise responses, making sure there's consistency, and having someone like Andrew on our team really is a benefit to these clients to make sure they're not stumbling over past documents that they may have created 2 years ago and now need to produce. So yeah, I think we've been able to help these clients really get organized and present the right message to the OIG.
And Bryan, this is like everything you do, which is how you say it, right? And that's why, as with a lot of things when you're dealing with the government, you don't really want to go it alone on this stuff, because how you answer the questions and, I think, Bryan, you love the word concise, you used it, and I think that is important. Sometimes people over-respond to stuff or over-explain things and answer more than the question being asked, and it's not really very helpful. And so I think that's something that when you have legal counsel good legal counsel should be able to help you hone in on it and sort of that's not responsive, that's not helpful, and that's not what they're getting at, because sometimes I think people have the tendency to not be as thoughtful maybe in word choice and how they present themselves.
Yeah, and it occurs in an audit like this. It occurs in so many situations where you're being scrutinized by the government. When I prepare people to be deposed, and that's by the government or by other private parties, you want to be honest and complete in your responses, but you don't want to volunteer information. You want to give the auditor, the questioner, what they have asked for, and leave it at that. We don't want to kind of guess at what more information might be helpful to them. And with an audit like these OIG audits, they're asking questions and asking for documents. Some of it, you can find documents that were created a couple years ago that fully respond to the request. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. Other ones, you do need to produce a new narrative response, but you don't want it to be inconsistent with what you've said before. So when you're addressing questions, one of the things I say is, have we already articulated an answer in a document that we can just say, see the attached document, as long as that document is responsive and it doesn't include a lot of extraneous information. That's a way to be concise, make sure you're not telling a similar but perhaps slightly different story every time, because it's hard to keep any kind of narrative straight when you're talking about what has happened over the course of years. If you have documents, produce the documents that help them. And Andrew, I think in these kinds of cases, the hospices being audited were required to submit prior documents. And so there's already material that the government has that you don't want to start contradicting now that you're in an audit.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And in fact, so if you're being audited, right, you would have already submitted a provider relief fund report quite some time ago. And what Bryan and I were finding in kind of reviewing some of the OIG's requests is that, just to Bryan's point, like the documents that we've already submitted, and in particular the report itself, actually fully answered some of the specific OIG requests. So kind of that's an instance where we can just kind of submit that report and not really have to provide kind of a additional kind of narrative type response.
I know something they were focused on in these audits was, if you have multiple entities, how you're spreading that money around. And we know that you were able to do that, and there are FAQs about that. But why don't you talk about that? Because a lot of our larger clients have a parent subsidiary model, and they were using it sort of throughout their company.
Yeah, that's right. Generally speaking, HHS gave hospices and other provider types a lot of latitude for kind of redistributing the provider relief fund payments kind of across the parent and subsidiary organizations. So if a subsidiary received a payment, it could assign that to the parent, and the parent could use that either on itself, on that subsidiary, on other subsidiaries. Now I'm speaking specifically of the general distribution, not the targeted distribution, because there are some more restrictions on the ability to kind of move that around the organization. But yeah, that's right, Meg. There's a lot of flexibility there. And we did kind of notice that some of the questions we're getting at that from the OIG. I think the OIG just wants to make sure, that when it's trying to look at your use of the provider relief fund payments, that it's including the entire use, no matter whether you're using payments that that one of your subsidiaries received, or if you're using your payments, to fund and reimburse costs and lost revenue from, a subsidiary. So, yeah, the OIG does seem to be kind of looking into that issue, even though, again, the HHS did give providers a lot of flexibility regarding how they kind of want to manage that.
So something you and I in particular, Andrew, spent lots and lots and lots of time thinking about, whatever that was 2.5 years ago. And you a little bit, Bryan. You came in to sprinkle the magic, but this whole idea of lost revenue, right? Like, and how to calculate that, and do you compare it to the year before, but then what if you had expected growth, and like, how do you do that? And I guess, what did you learn about through this OIG audit about how folks are calculating lost revenue? Like, how what kinds of questions does the government have about that?
Just to kind of provide a brief recap, there are 3 different options you could choose for how you calculate lost revenue for purposes of using the provider relief fund payment. So the first option essentially looked at your expenditures for whatever period of time the payments apply to, and comparing that to a baseline of 2019 patient care revenue. The second option was to kind of look at your actual revenue, and then compare that to a baseline of a budgeted revenue. But there are some limitations to that approach, because the budget had to have been approved by, I think it was March 27th, 2020. And then the third option was basically kind of a create your own option. So as long as the option was reasonable, you could kind of develop your own methodology for how you want to calculate lost revenue, with the major caveat that even at the time, the HRSA was saying that you're at a higher risk of being audited if you go with that third approach. So we've been, in kind of helping clients through this OIG audit process. We have encountered at least one hospice that did pursue that alternate lost revenue calculation methodology. That doesn't appear to be the reason they were selected. Again, I think the reason was more about kind of the amount of funding you got and ensuring that the OIG was kind of, being geographically diverse in terms of who was selected. But the OIG, I would say generally is asking kinds of the questions you'd expect them to ask on the lost revenue side of things. They basically want you to prove that the revenue that you were reporting on your report is accurate. So they're asking for things like cost reports. They're asking for kind of just what your patient care revenue was for the time period at issue. And then if you did pursue that third option, the alternative methodology, the OIG wants kind of whatever documentation you've been maintaining to kind of support the reasonableness of that. Now, again, this is kind of an area where Bryan was talking about earlier, where if you did pursue that option, you would have already had to have submitted substantiating documents to HRSA as part of your report. So not a lot of new kind of information you have to provide there that you haven't already provided, but those are kind of the things that the OIG seems to be looking at in this audit on the lost revenue front.
The other thing, again, it's like all coming back that hours and hours and hours we spent on that slide deck. But what has been nice is, I think, all of the energy and thought we put into that sort of from the get-go has really served us well. And I mean, you've been fantastic in this, Andrew, in terms of staying on top of all of this, and you were there from the very beginning on, how to create accountability within the system, what are defensible ways to calculate lost revenue. And I guess one thing before I ask my last question here, in terms of partnership and if I'm a hospice, who are the people that help support me on an audit like this? And obviously, lawyers are not money people, right? We're not accountants. And so I think there is a role that your accountant has probably been having throughout, this entire time. And a way, keeping them involved in this. But I also think there is this lawyer component too about how you present information and things like that. And so I do think having a strong relationship with your accountant who can, hopefully if you chose an option 3, your accountant was giving their 2 cents on that as well.
And I think that's important, Meg, because the standard that the hospice is going to need to meet is reasonable. And that's the question the OIG is posing, is explain to us how your alternative method of lost revenue calculation is reasonable. And what reasonable means is something that we've encouraged from the outset people to start thinking about and documenting. And with our clients who have taken that advice, they have that documentation in place and they're not having to appear to rationalize an excuse. So that's great to have that handy. But how the government is going to define reasonable will be a very interesting thing that we'll keep our eye on when we get the audit results or when they're reported publicly. Because the current audits are for calendar year 2022 funds received during that year. I expect there's going to be audits for funds received in 2021 and 2022. I may have misspoke. The
2020.
For 2020. Yeah. They're going to get them for 2021 and 2022. And we may be able to learn from this audit as to what kind of lost revenue calculations is the government going to think are reasonable, and what are the vulnerabilities of the ones that they conclude are not reasonable, so that we can continue to try to react and advocate for our clients based upon whatever lost revenue calculation they decided to advance.
As is the case with so many things, it's what's your contemporaneous documentation that you were following this plan, right? So the infrastructure, and I remember this in our slide deck about what kinds of policies and procedures do you have, what kind of account are these funds held in, and do you have a committee? How do you keep track of receipts? Like all of that infrastructure, and right, you can't go create that. I mean, you had to have it sort of from the get-go that you can hearken back to. And I think their questions included, what kinds of safeguards did you have? How were you creating accountability within your organization? And right, because you probably carried out this plan like, okay, this is how we're going to, track our expenses and lost revenue, but then how are you monitoring that yourself, right? You don't rely on the government. Your government is not your monitor, right? Or you don't want them to be. This is something you did internally. So, as we close up here, Andrew, what did you learn about the kinds of safeguards and oversight they wanted or expected hospices to have?
For, better or worse, they did seem to focus a lot on policies and procedures. Both actually wanting to see, policies and procedures that specifically that you use to kind of, manage and properly use your provider relief fund payment. Now, if you didn't create like a specific policy and procedure for the provider relief fund, I imagine a lot of hospices didn't do that because they already had existing policies that kind of would apply, regardless of the source of the funds. But the OIG did kind of want to see if you had memorialized your processes in writing through a policy and procedure. They were asking questions about kind of how you segregated your money, whether it be creating a whole separate account and storing the money there until you use it, or just kind of creating sub accounts and tracking it with codes that, then they wanted to know about. And just generally speaking, financial oversight. They asked questions about, who was responsible for kind of administering the funds in the organization. They asked for kind of org charts for like the finance department. So, and to your point earlier, Meg, about kind of, the importance of the accountant, both I would say external accountants, but also kind of your internal finance people are going to be really key for, involving them is going to be key for kind of demonstrating that you were compliant, you set up proper oversight, that sort of thing.
I think this is ultimately, right, if you're not one of the selected 30, and this could be a rolling request, so not maybe all of the 30 have gotten notice that they're one of the selected few, but I think to your point, Bryan, to plug our own podcast, like I think it's important for everyone to listen to this because this is not going to be a one and done, as with much of what the OIG in their audits. This may dictate future enforcement and future monitoring based on, right, this is the first audit of what will likely be many. So I think it's helpful for everyone to hear, what happened in these, what to expect, because they're going to do something in 2021. We had other clients who are still getting money, right? So this is a ton of money. And we all know, if we look at the hospice industry as a whole, as hospice grew, right, then our enforcement increased, and now we are where we are with all these alphabet soup audits with UPIC, CPI, all that stuff. So there are always strings attached to government money, and rightfully so, in the sense, if you're going to shell out billions of dollars, you want to create some accountability with the taxpayer funds that are getting used. So I think that this is an important listen to anyone, because even if you're not one of the 30, you could be in the future. These audits, I think, are going to continue for many, many years, and they're going to learn stuff about what the vulnerabilities are, and that's going to be what they, focus on. So I'm sure this is going to be one of many podcasts we do as we learn more about what the OIG's findings are, what their concerns are, because I'm sure there are going to be concerns raised in this report. for the healthcare industry as a whole. So anyway.
Well, maybe this will be the one report where they say everything's just fine.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
billions and billions were used, and it's
Yeah.
it was done just perfect. There was no gray area, right? It was just all good, right? Things are simple. So, just kudos to you, Andrew, in particular, for keeping our team. It's so wonderful because our team is now so large, to have these substantive experts. I mean, obviously, you do a lot of other stuff other than this, but when this happened, it was so great to not only our team, but our clients too, we were preparing for this, and we were ready to go, and you were ready to go. So I think we did a great job leading the client through this process. So.
Well, thank you very much. That's very kind. It's a fun area, even if, there are these strings attached and we got to kind of work through the issues now. But happy to help out, and let us know if you, the listener, have any questions about the Provider Relief Fund or want to know more about these audits.
Well, I'm sure more to come. Thank you.
Thanks, Meg.
Bye.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Hospice Insights, The Law and Beyond. Thank you for joining the conversation. To subscribe to our podcast, visit our website at hushblackwell.com or sign up wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, may the wind be at your back.